So we can just start right in. Years ago you wrote an article or an essay called Responsibility of Intellectuals. So we'll start there and move on to all sorts of other topics. The first problem with that title was, what's an intellectual? So what is an intellectual?
It's not a term I use very much, but it's a term that's used. It refers to people who have sufficient privilege and opportunity so that they're able to speak about affairs of human interest and concern and do it with a degree of prestige and authority which may or may not be warranted. They're called intellectuals. So a physicist working in a lab is not called an intellectual, but if he happens to give a talk on nuclear proliferation, yeah, then he's an intellectual. A literary critic who writes about English poets in the late 19th century is not an intellectual, but if he happens to discuss the cultural changes that are developing in the modern world, well, okay, then he is an intellectual. If say a shoemaker happens to have a very insightful commentary on international affairs or domestic affairs or human relations, he's usually not called an intellectual. Okay, but it's not a very meaningful term.
Nonetheless, what's then an intellectual's responsibility, the focus of your essay?
We start with the fact that the people designated as intellectuals have privileges, otherwise they wouldn't enter into that category. They have a degree of authority, prestige, justified or not, and these characteristics confer responsibility. The more privilege yields opportunity. Prestige, deserved or not, yields a degree of credibility. The more opportunity and credibility you have, the more responsibility you have. Pretty straightforward, like almost everything.
But what's the nature of the responsibility? In other words, if we say that an intellectual is failing to meet her responsibility, what does that mean?
We can start with some elementary moral principles that any decent human being ought to accept, and in fact most people will say they accept. So for example, one elementary truism is that we should apply to ourselves the same standards we apply to others, if not more rigid standards. In fact, should be more rigid standards. So one responsibility of intellectuals is to look at the facts of past and current history, look at the actions of, say, our enemies and the way we've treated them, and look at ourselves and the way we've treated ourselves, and then ask whether we are meeting that elementary moral condition. And that arises all the time. So, for example, there happens to be an inquiry going on in England where they're investigating Tony Blair, Jack Straw, and others for the background of their involvement in the invasion of Iraq. There's no such inquiry in the United States. The United States, people with power and privilege are immune from any inquiry or discussion. That's part of the prerogatives of imperial power. But there is one in England. Well, it's elementary that Blair was involved in direct aggression. Lawyers will try to work their way out of that conclusion, but that's their job. But it's elementary. Look at the definition of aggression in, say, the Nuremberg proceedings, the General Assembly, and so on. Yes, it's invasion of Iraq's a textbook case. Well, there's a way to deal with aggression when it's enemies who carry it out. In fact, that's what the Nuremberg Tribunal was about. It's the a gold standard for how to deal with crimes of aggression. That was the major crime charged at Nuremberg. There were other crimes, but so, for example, the German foreign minister, von Ribbentrop, was hanged. One of the major charges was that he was involved in a preemptive war. The Germans invaded Norway, and he was foreign minister, so of course he's involved. They invaded Norway because they knew, in fact it was not a secret, that Britain was planning to use a base in Norway to attack Germany. So this falls under what's called preemptive war. You carry out military aggression to stop an impending attack on yourself. And he was hanged. Well, okay, let's take Colin Powell.
Before we go into this, because this will come up later, I just want to hang with the intellectuals for a second. To make it more concrete, can you give some examples of, just a few, or as many as you want, of people who you think do fulfill the responsibility of intellectuals? Let's say in the United States, or maybe, and what makes you say that about the particular person?
What makes me say it is that they do...
The specific people.
Oh, well, let's take Howard Zinn, who died recently, or Iqbal Ahmed, who died a couple of years earlier, or Edward Said, who died shortly before Iqbal. Well, these happen to be old personal friends, but they were also... Edward and Iqbal were very close friends. Iqbal and Howard were close friends and interacted constantly. So they were a kind of a cadre, if you like, of prominent intellectuals, scholars, activists. Their lives and their work were intimately intertwined, and they dedicated a large part of their lives and work to pursuing elementary moral truisms. I could run through them, but that's what they did. So, okay, that's responsible intellectuals.
Okay, maybe a way to see it is some intellectuals, but not journalists, because we're going to get to journalism in a minute, who fail miserably, who have the prestige, who have the access, who have all the characteristics that you describe as associated with being an intellectual, but who don't meet their responsibility, violate it routinely.
I
know there are a lot.
You want to start from A? We'll go on for the rest of the day. But it's virtually everyone.
Just give a few specific examples where you give the person and the instance.
All right, let's take. Let's take a couple of years ago. The New York Times published some released tapes, Nixon tapes. A big battle about it. Henry Kissinger didn't want them released. I think there was a court trial. Finally, they were released, and there was an article about it. If you look through the tapes, most of the it led to a lot of discussion, mostly gossip, nasty things Nixon said about somebody, or anti-Semitic remarks or something. But there was one sentence that appeared in the article, which, as far as I could see, elicited no comment at all, except for me and a couple other people. It was a point where they were talking about the bombing of Cambodia, and Nixon kind of was ranting on about Cambodia, and he told Kissinger, his loyal servant, that he wanted him to relay orders to the Pentagon about bombing of Cambodia. And Kissinger obediently did so. His words were something like this to the military: anything that flies against anything that moves. Now, if you look through the archival record of all states, it's going to be hard to find a call for genocide that's so clear and explicit. And it wasn't just words, because it happened. A few years ago, two leading Cambodia scholars, Taylor Owen and Ben Kiernan, published an article in Canada in which they discussed documents that had been released during the Clinton years about the bombing of Cambodia. And it turns out that it was known that the bombing was extremely intense. That was known right away. It turns out it was 5 times as high as what had been reported. The bombing of rural Cambodia was greater than the total Allied bombing in all theaters during World War II. And as they point out, the effect of the bombing was to turn the Khmer Rouge from a kind of a marginal guerrilla group that nobody knew anything about to a mass army of what they call enraged peasants who wanted to take revenge for this monstrous atrocity. Well, we know what happened later. Okay, so how did intellectuals react to this? It's easy to check. The Kiernan Owen article, as far as I'm aware, appeared once in the United States, namely on ZNet. I've never seen any other mention of it. As far as I know, it appeared nowhere in England. And I doubt if it appeared anywhere else. It has never received any comment that I've seen. The Kissinger remark disappeared. It was of no interest. There was no comment on it when it was published. In fact, it was kind of like a side remark in the article. The gossip was much more interesting. And if you check the records, you'll find the same. Actually, I've brought all of this up repeatedly in talks to respectable audiences, the Royal Institute of Philosophy in England, which is deeply concerned with issues of moral philosophy, comparable groups here, specialists on Cambodia, and journals which posture heroically about the terrible crimes of the Khmer Rouge. Nobody can hear the words. I mean, it's as if you're talking to a filter that cuts out certain words and phrases. Now, the Kissinger remarks happened to be approximately at the time when the International Tribunal was trying Milosevic. And he died before the judgment, but they were having a really hard time putting together much of a case. We could go through the details of that. They're interesting, but they were having a pretty hard time. It was mostly,
as compared to the trivialese with which
well, suppose they had found a statement from Milosevic saying anything that flies against anything that moves.
Right.
There would have been euphoria all over the world, the Western world. He'd immediately be tried, executed. We'd talk about how noble we are, and so on and so forth. Okay, now this is virtually 100% of intellectuals I'm talking about.
So we have a kind of a fact to explain. There's a relatively small number, almost infinitesimal, of people who fulfill the responsibility of intellectuals. They use their credibility, they use their access, they use their tools, et cetera, to try and discuss reality in a way that actually is consistent with human well-being and consistency and so on. Then we have virtually everybody who has those attributes, who has those advantages, who is capable of understanding when it serves their interests. So they'll search far and wide for something about somebody who they wish to prosecute, but is completely incapable, as you describe it, even incapable of hearing the words when it's contrary to this background of interest. Okay, now it might not matter because the fact is the crucial thing, but lots and lots of people hear that, and the way that they dismiss it is to say it can't be, because what would explain it? Why would all those people behave in such a way? How could they possibly have the mental capacity to see the truth and not see the truth? It must be the small number of people who are confused, not the large number of people. How do you answer that? That is, how do you explain the phenomenon being so lopsided?
Actually, Orwell had a word for it. He called it doublethink. A doublethink is the capacity to hold two contradictory ideas in mind and believe them both. That's practically a defining characteristic of intellectual history. Secondly, it is not. I'm not talking about the United States. As far as I know, this is close to historically universal.
Right. No,
I find very few exceptions. Right. And furthermore, it goes back to the earliest recorded history. Furthermore, every person who asks this question knows the answer. All they have to do is look at themselves. How many people have failed to go through an experience like, for example, when you're 6 years old and your little brother takes a toy and You want the toy, and your mother's not looking, and you're bigger than he is, so you grab the toy. And then the kid starts yelling, and your mother comes in, and she starts censuring you for taking the toy. And how do you answer? You say, yeah, I took the toy because I wanted it, and he's smaller than me. Or do you say, look, he didn't want the toy anyway, and besides it was mine, and he really stole it from me, so I was right.
In other words,
can you know anybody?
Answer,
can you know who anybody who hasn't gone through such experiences in their life?
And you give the second answer, not the first.
Yeah, so we all know the answer to the question.
Right.
There are ways, easy ways, to rationalize whatever happens in a usually complicated world, so as to protect yourself. Furthermore, the fact that intellectuals act like this is close to tautology. You don't become a respected intellectual unless you do this kind of thing, not like Kissinger, just servility of the master, but because you internalize it. Just take a look at history. There are people who don't do it, a small portion. They're usually, are they praised? Are they honored? They're usually treated very badly. Depends on the nature of the society. They can be thrown out of their jobs. In a civilized society like ours, they just get vilified and defamed. In a U.S. possession, like say El Salvador, they get their brains blown out, and nobody here even cares about it or knows about it. In, say, the post-Stalin Soviet Union, they got sent to prison or exiled. And if you go through history, furthermore, it's kind of striking that, let's just take that last example. Compare the old Soviet Union, pre-Gorbachev, post-Stalin, different period, pre-Gorbachev, and compare, say, U.S. possessions at the same time. Actually, we've just gone through a very revealing incident about how intellectuals react to that. In November 2009, there was enormous attention given to and celebration of some very critical events that took place exactly 20 years earlier, in November 1989. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and quickly the Soviet Union collapsed. That was a major event in world history. And there was a huge commemoration of it on the 20th anniversary. And what was written about it is mostly accurate and very revealing. It was heralded as a triumph, quoting Václav Havel, one of the heroes, a triumph of love and nonviolence. Love and nonviolence overcame the Soviet Union and it collapsed. And that's the lesson we learned. In fact, there's a generation of people who call themselves the Niners. Their consciousness was formed in November 1989, and they're dedicated to love and nonviolence. Obama is picked as the leader, and so on. So that's what we learned in November 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Well, 1 week after the fall of the Berlin Wall, something else happened. An elite Salvadoran battalion, which had just come from several months of training at the John F. Kennedy Special Forces School in Fort Bragg, and in fact, a couple of days later had a special group of, I think, a couple of dozen special forces sent to El Salvador to beef up their training. This is the top battalion in the Salvadoran Army, the pride of the U.S.-run Salvadoran Army. Right after that, they broke into the university. They murdered 6 leading Salvadoran intellectuals, Jesuit priests, also their housekeeper and her daughter. In November 2009, a report was published in the Spanish press, easily accessible to anyone, in the Spanish press, presenting the actual document that ordered the assassination, signed, as had been suspected but not proven, signed by the chief of staff and the top officials in the Salvadoran army, all so close to the Pentagon and the U.S. Embassy that you can barely find a ray of light between them. Of course, it was never published here and never published in England and so on. So all of that happened in 1989. Well, it wasn't just, that's love and nonviolence. Now, it's not just the killing of the Jesuit intellectuals. The killing of the Jesuit intellectuals closed off a decade of monstrous atrocities. In El Salvador, maybe 70,000 people killed, another 100,000 in Guatemala, who knows how many in Nicaragua, all organized right in Washington. A massive terrorist war. The decade in El Salvador, plenty of religious martyrs. In fact, the decade started with the assassination of an archbishop reading Mass by the same hands. So it's not a small event. Furthermore, that understates it. There's a huge event that took place. It has to do with history of the Catholic Church. The Church in the early centuries was radical pacifist. That's why Christians were persecuted, because they were radical pacifists. In the early 4th century,
We're going far afield. I know it's the same point. I know it's the same point.
We're not going far.
No, I know it's the same
continue.
point. Okay.
And this is exactly to the point. In the 4th century, the radical pacifist church was changed. The Emperor Constantine took it over and turned it into the Church of the Roman Empire. So the cross, which had been a symbol of the suffering of the poor, was on the shield of the Roman Empire. Well, from the 4th century until almost today, the church was the church of the rich and the persecutors. In 1962, Pope John the 23rd changed it. He called Vatican II, big conference, and that adopted what was called the preferential option for the poor. It's from the Gospels. And that led to a movement, particularly in Latin America, where priests, nuns, lay people, others, started bringing the message of the Gospels to poor peasants and trying to get them to think about their horrifying conditions under U.S.-dominated tyrannies and try to organize to do something about it. Well, the U.S. didn't wait long. Immediately, it reacted. John F. Kennedy organized a military coup in Brazil, one of the main centers. A coup took place right after the assassination. It was all set up by him and Robert Kennedy. That established the first of the neo-Nazi-style national security states in Latin America, torture, massacre, and so on. And Brazil's a big country, so the dominoes started to fall. And country after country fell under a plague of repression that had no parallel since the conquistadors. Uruguay, Chile, Allende, finally ended up with Argentina, maybe the worst killers of them all and Reagan's favorites. And finally it spread to Central America in the 1980s. Then came these hideous terrorist wars. Throughout, a large part of it was a war against the church. And we know who was responsible because they take pride in it. So the School of the Americas, now renamed, which trains Latin American killers, you take a look at its talking points, advertising points. It takes credit for the fact, as it says, that the U.S. Army helped defeat liberation theology. That is, helped destroy the Church of the Gospels. That's not a small event in history. It's a rather significant event in history. And it was effectively terminated by the massacre in November 1989. Of course, not totally. There are residues. You never kill ideas completely. Is that a major event? Well, take a look and see how much commentary there was on it. I can give you 100% of the commentary.
Next to zero.
Okay, but I can even take here in Boston where we are. I know of one discussion of it in Boston, at Boston College, the Jesuit University, where in fact I was one of the speakers, but one of the speakers was Jan Sobrino. He's the one surviving Jesuit, came up to give a talk. A very good talk. What he pointed out and stressed was that murdering the Jesuit intellectuals was terrible enough, but much worse was murdering their housekeeper and daughter, who, as he put it, are the symbols of the crucified populations of U.S. domains. How many comments were there on that? Well, there actually was a comment. The hero of Eastern Europe, Václav Havel, came to the United States shortly after the murder of his Jesuit colleagues in El Salvador, and he gave a speech to a joint session of Congress, and he got a rousing standing ovation for calling the United States the defender of freedom. The press was just, and commentators were totally euphoric, including the left. So, you know, Washington Post had editorials about why can't we have amazing intellectuals like this who tell us that we're the defender of freedom, right? Having slaughtered his counterparts in El Salvador, plus everything that came before. Anthony Lewis, you know, way out at the far left of imaginable criticism, gushed about how we were in a romantic age. It's hard to believe it's a romantic age, and so on and so forth. Okay, does any of this enter history? Can it even be comprehended? In fact, I've tried to talk about it, blank wall, or else fury, usually fury, and reaction saying, "Oh, you're justifying atrocities. You're justifying Stalin." You know, yeah.
So the picture is, even in the case of incredible barbarism, over extended periods of time, individuals who are intellectuals, meaning they've accrued this respect and these tools and these resources and so on, for purposes of advancing their own career and of being taken seriously and of being appreciated, sort of habitually, almost reflexively, follow the party line.
But there are people who don't.
And then there are some who
in fact, it starts very early.
What's the difference?
It starts in childhood.
No, I don't mean what's the difference in behavior. I mean maybe you've thought about this and maybe you haven't. If you have to, I mean, of course you can take the two sets of people and you can say, okay, this one said this and this one said this, and that's the difference. But there might be also a difference in their value system or in their personality or in something that explains why somebody ends up over here and somebody over here, which matters to people who are about to go to journalism school or about to go to college and want to be here and not here.
The question for their mothers and their psychologists, psychiatrists, and so on.
Notions.
They vary. And we know they vary because we know all these people. And they have all kind of different reasons. Whether it's a 6-year-old kid stealing a toy from his brother, or Anthony Lewis talking about a romantic age when we've just carried out a mass slaughter, or, you know, they vary, all kind of reasons. And it's maybe of interest to their family and friends, but it's of no general interest. What's of general interest is the way the system works. And it works starting very early. I mean, I could give exact examples, but I'll just talk about it generally. I mean, suppose a kid in, say, 3rd grade decides that what the teacher is saying is ridiculous, and he's not going to do it. I can give you some examples if you like. Well, what happens is he's classified. He becomes a behavior problem. Right. If some other kid sitting next to him says, yeah, of course what the teacher's saying is ridiculous, but I'm going to do it, he's a nice kid, and he goes on. And it sort of goes on from there. There's filtering systems like this all the way. If you sit on a if you're on a university faculty and you get letters of recommendation for, you know, students who want to apply, or faculty members who are looking for a job, there's some standard terminology that you get used to. A great guy, brilliant, wonderful, but he lacks collegiality, you know, or he's hard to get along with, or something like that. What that usually means is he's a political radical or something like that. So, and it's kind of nobody will tell you. I mean, some people will, like, you know, I can name 5 people who will tell you, but it's kind of understood, and it's even understandable. I mean, you want your department to be collegial. You want people to be nice to each other. You don't want somebody in the department getting up and saying, look, you're a war criminal, and showing it and demonstrating it. That's not nice. It doesn't feel good. Yes, so you sort of keep these people away. You've had a little experience with this yourself. So there's techniques that start from childhood, a massive filtering system, and it means that You know, it's not 100%. You know, even a totalitarian state isn't 100%. This certainly isn't. But they're very effective filtering systems that lead to certain outcomes. It's quite interesting for people like Ed Herman or me or others who do critical analysis of the press. Journalists and commentators are infuriated. They say, nobody tells me what to write, which is absolutely true. But if they didn't already know what to write, they wouldn't be there.
So the solution, whether we're talking intellectuals or journalists, isn't in the genes of the people, and it isn't even in, it's in the structure of the situations that they find themselves in, which over and over and over produce this kind of almost reflexive behavior, to the point where they don't have to think about it. They don't have, it's not as if they're making a conscious choice. Okay, today I will lie about barbarism in order to get an extra star on my resume. They just do it because they've done it all along and they keep doing it.
It's very dramatic if you look at, journalism's kind of like an easy target and a little bit unfair. Okay. Because a journalist has to get something out tomorrow, they can't think about it much and so on. Much more interesting is scholarship. That's why most of my own critical work is on scholarship, not on journalism. Because in the case of scholarship, people have time, they have resources, they have security, they can think about what they're doing. What you find is, with very rare exceptions, pretty much the same thing. Like take, say, the study of, there's a huge study of American foreign policy and international relations. And I just happen to have been reading one of the most prestigious international relations journal, which is partially devoted to one of the lead issues, which is called American Wilsonian Idealism. So one of the main theses in international relations theory dealing with the United States is the impact of Wilsonian idealism. Well, you know, it's quite interesting. I mean, these articles I happen to read are typical, so I'll pick them, but it runs through the whole field. The people are on. The study of Wilsonian idealism keeps to almost entirely to words. You know, so we ask, when Wilson said self-determination, did he mean this or did he mean that? And you have a big scholarly discussion of it, and you look at his letters and what he wrote to his wife. But you don't look at any of the facts. And the facts are glaringly obvious right now. So right now, for example, Haiti, as everyone knows, has been hit by an incredible disaster. You know, hundreds of thousands of people killed, you know, billions of dollars of damage. Everybody wants to give $10 to show how wonderful we are. Did Wilsonian idealism have anything to do with this? I mean, you have to be blind not to see it. Wilson's plenty of other things, but Wilson was one of the worst killers in Haiti. He destroyed the country. It was already half destroyed by the French. And, he sent the Marines into Haiti on ridiculous pretexts, as always. They killed thousands of people, according to Haitian historians, maybe 15,000 people. They reinstated virtual slavery. Remember, Haiti was liberated as a slave revolt. One of the main things they did, and this is Wilsonian idealism, was Wilson sent the Marines to disband Parliament. Haiti had a parliament. It was kind of derided in the United States. So they disbanded Parliament at gunpoint. And the reason was very simple. The U.S. had written a constitution. Actually, Franklin Delano Roosevelt took credit for it, probably boasting. But anyway, there was a U.S. written constitution, which the Parliament refused to accept. Why? Because the Constitution contained what were called in the United States progressive measures, namely permitting U.S. corporations to buy up Haiti's lands. Now, it was explained, by economists and other serious thinkers that this was very progressive, because obviously Haiti needs foreign investment. And how can you expect Americans to invest unless they own the place? So this is just for the benefit of Haitians that we're doing this. if you read the press and commentary, it's just we're so benevolent, tears come from our eyes. We're trying desperately to help them. And then the Marines ran a referendum in which 5% of the population participated, the traditional collaborationist elite that you find in every colony, the rich elite. They participated, and there was 99.9% approval. So it was a democratic election, and they got the progressive legislation with the obvious consequences. Well, one of the consequences is to add a further blow to the agricultural system, leading to urbanization. This goes on right into the night. I won't go through the record, but Clinton was one of the worst offenders in this respect. Destroy the agricultural system for reasons that every economist can explain are very rational. It was explained. I mean, Haiti shouldn't be producing rice. It's much more efficient in the world if highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness, which gets most of its profits from subsidies, floods Haiti with rice. And Haiti's rice farmers are quite efficient, which of course can't compete with it, if they go into the cities so women can sew baseballs and miserable assembly plants. That's efficient. I mean, any decent economist can explain that. And of course we want to be efficient and progressive. So we drive them into the cities, we destroy the agricultural system. Along comes a hurricane. It's a class-based disaster, like most disasters. You take a look, the rich people up in the hills, got shaken up a little, but nothing much happened. Huge catastrophe among the poor people living in urban slums. Why are we there? Why are they there? Well, Wilsonian idealism had a lot to do with it. All of these things are happening at the same moment. At the same moment that the scholarly articles are appearing about Wilsonian idealism, and what did he write to his wife in a letter, and did he mean this, that, or the other thing? At the same moment, the front pages are showing us about this hideous class-based disaster, which substantially results from one of many of Wilson's horrendous crimes. And now we get back to Orwell and doublethink. If you want to be a respected intellectual, you have to have both these ideas in your mind at the same time and believe both of them and not notice the contradiction. And this is overwhelming. I'm happy picking it because it's so dramatic, but you just take a look at, on and on. I mean, sometimes it's awesome.
Most of the time. Most of the time. There's this idea of objectivity. And lots of people on the left get very excited about that critical of it. They get upset by the idea of objectivity. So I'm wondering, as a precursor to asking you about objectivity, first, broadly, you and Ed wrote about this. How does bad journalism work, and what are the linchpins of it? Now I'm not talking about, well, answer as you will. And how would good journalism work instead? What is it about the behavior of the New York Times that is abhorrent to you?
Things like what I've described.
And what is it structurally within the New York Times which causes it, in your view?
Well, first of all, the New York Times is not very much different from the elite intellectual culture in general. Right. So my own view is it's much more striking in scholarship and more significant. But in the New York Times, there are kind of obvious institutional factors. The New York Times is a major corporation, huge corporate system. Like other businesses, it sells a product to a market. The product is other businesses, advertisers, that's what keeps it going. The product for the New York Times happens to be fairly privileged audiences. It's what's sometimes called the political class, the maybe 20% of the population that are managers, economic, political, doctrinal managers, and so on. So what the New York, and furthermore, it's tightly linked to other institutions of power, like the state, for example, which is enormously under corporate influence. In fact, that's blaring at us every day in the newspapers. So here you have a system.
Just clarify, you're saying that they're selling that 20%, that sector of the population, to companies. They're selling the audience to the advertisers. That's the real product that they're selling.
Part of it. But they're also linked to state power to other corporate power. I mean, these are the, that's the circles in which they live. That's who you have dinner with. There's a flow up and back of people. And same with NPR and so on. There's a small elite group which have institutional roots. Now there are plenty of honest journalists, and do good work, but they do it within this framework. And if they sort of drift from the framework, they're usually cut off. In fact, some quit in disgust. But it's kind of like the rest of the filtering system. Well, what do you expect to come out of a system like that? Suppose you're looking at it from Mars. You see huge corporations selling privileged people who are managers themselves to other businesses, linked to other systems of power like the state, which are heavily influenced, in fact, dominated by these power systems. What kind of product do you expect to come out?
That's what you see.
That's what you see.
Okay, so then what about good journalism? In other words, what would you do to generate?
There are concrete examples. A couple of months ago, I happened to go to Mexico. I was invited for the 25th anniversary of a newspaper, which as far as I'm aware is the only independent newspaper in the hemisphere. It's called La Jornada. It's very successful. It's the second largest newspaper in Mexico. It gets no commercial advertising because business hates it. It has very smart reporters and good people, really bright, the kind of intellectuals you and I would like. They write for it. They do investigative reporting. It has regional subsidiaries. I think the only Mexican journal that reports regularly from Chiapas, where they have a regional office, and elsewhere. How does it survive? Subscriptions. I mean, there are probably a couple of wealthy donors who give it some money, but primarily it subscribes from a very loyal subscriber base. And it's the second largest journal in Mexico. And just a couple of days I was there, just reading it, I learned things, important things, I could tell you, that did not appear in the Western press. Okay, how do they do it? Well, that's how they do it.
And they eliminate the advertising as the source of revenue.
They'd be happy to get advertising. I mean, they'd be happy to get advertising, but business is highly class conscious. They're not going to subsidize Z magazine.
But clearly they're not appealing to it. They're not doing what you need to do to attract those kinds of ads, right?
As far as I can, I'm sure there's plenty of criticisms you can make.
Are they objective?
Well,
what does it mean?
The notion of objectivity belongs in graduate philosophy seminars. It doesn't apply in the real world. This is a topic for elite intellectuals to have abstract discussions about. Anybody, whoever they are, has a point of view. You can't help it. If you're doing quantum physics, you're looking for certain things and you're not looking at other things. Maybe what you're not looking at turns out to be extremely important. But you cannot help having a point of view.
So the whole discussion is a waste of time.
The whole discussion is a waste of time.
Good.
And there's, like most discussions that take place, I mean, there are clear cases where you can see that the search for what is called balance is a charade. I mean, so let's take something really important, like the survival of the species. It should be an important question. There's two views on the matter of whether the species can have decent survival. One of them is 99.9% of scientists who say we're really getting into trouble with anthropogenic warming of the atmosphere. On the other side, there's Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, Sarah Palin, Congressman Himhoff, the editors in the...
But you don't see the balance, that those crazies occupy 98% of the airwaves?
No, when you see an article in the New York Times or anywhere else, they have to balance it. Yeah. And so you get both positions. And the end result, and of course, there's a ton of advertising and propaganda from the business world that wants you to believe it's not happening, which is kind of interesting itself, because the executives who are doing this advertising know exactly as well as the scientists that it is happening. And they know that it's going to destroy their grandchildren, and it's going to destroy everything that they own, but they still want people not to believe it. Now, there are institutional factors there, too. They go back to the nature of markets, go into that. The future of the species is an externality. You don't consider it when you are making involved in transactions. So there's good reasons for that too. But anyway, it's happening, and we see the results. I mean, the results have been so incredible that by now there's a sharp decline in the United States in belief in human anthropogenic, human-involved global warming. It's down now to about a third. Okay, now that's a death sentence for the species. I mean, if that continues, and I'm really not exaggerating. Yeah. I mean, we can argue about the time span, but it's going to lead to.
The people who were saying it were smiled at over lunch.
Oh yeah, because if you're in a market system, take these executives. See, that's an interesting case. You're the CEO of, say, ExxonMobil. You read everything that people read in the Z magazine. You know what's happening. You know exactly what's happening. You know that the danger is extremely severe, and that the longer we wait, the worse it's going to be. But that's what economists call an externality. It doesn't enter into your day-by-day decisions. Your day-by-day decisions in a market system are forced. You are forced to look at certain things and not to look at others. So you are forced to look at short-term profit and market share. If you don't do that, you're out, and somebody else is in.
And you can actually rationalize doing it on grounds that, well, if I didn't do it, I'd be out, therefore I couldn't do any good for anybody ever.
I don't think that's the grounds that it's done. Not that I'll be out, it's that I'm really doing the right thing.
That's what I'm saying.
I'm really doing the right thing for the world. Because if I get people not to believe in what I know is true, then maybe they'll put more money into solar energy, and incidentally, maybe I'll make some profit out of that, as they're trying to do. So in the long run, it's really good for the species. It's not that different from stealing a toy from your brother. Yeah. Except that in this case, it's forced by an institution, namely the market.
One of the dynamics of that you mentioned is that if you're an intellectual or a journalist, there's tremendous price to pay for being good. You're marginalized, your material well-being is hurt, you're in certain danger depending upon where you are, etc.
Thrown out by a U.S.-run elite battalion. A lot of things can happen.
Okay. We can't offset that entirely, but still, can you name some good journalists around the world and in the U.S. who deserve to be known, and for another reason, which is imagine somebody who's off to journalism school. They're told who the good journalists are, and of course they're the irresponsible intellectuals, etc., etc. And it would do wonders if they actually took a look at people who were a model of what one should be doing. So who are some of the people who, in your view, are really good journalists?
The correspondents on the ground do extremely good work. I mean, if I were on a desert island somewhere and I was allowed to have only one newspaper, I'd get the New York Times. I mean, it gives you a tolerable picture of what's going on in the world. And the journalists who are on the ground typically don't lie. They describe accurately what they see. Same with reading, say, the AP wires. The journalists on the ground, I could give names, but there are plenty of them. In fact, I think it's normal. It's kind of interesting that in the book that Ed Herman and I wrote, Manufacturing Consent, a large part, it's hated by journalists and the press and intellectuals because they claim it's attacking the press, it's unfair. Actually, a large part of the book is defending the press. If anyone opens the book, they'll find that a substantial part of it is defending the press against attacks from what are considered the liberals. Freedom House, the main institution that's supposed to support freedom and democracy, launched a huge attack on the press, several volumes of denunciations, claiming that the press lost the war in Vietnam because they lied about the Tet Offensive. They're so pro-communist and antagonistic to the United States that they distorted what happened, and therefore we lost this noble war. That's Freedom House. Well, Ed and I went through the 2 volumes. We found that the number of outright lies straight lies was just phenomenal. When we actually looked at the facts, what we found is the reporters on the ground were reporting what happened honestly, courageously, and accurately, but within a framework that is just destroyed by ideological fanaticism. So somebody would write an article saying, you know, the Air Force came and they bombed this place to smithereens, and the soldiers came in, they killed everybody who was around. And, you know, it's just necessary to defend freedom and democracy in South Vietnam. Yeah. So the reporters were honest, professional, accurate, but deeply ideological. In contrast, Freedom House was just lying through their teeth.
In that case, presumably for you, the model of a good reporter, good journalist, good commentator is not only somebody who relays facts that they see, but is not subject to that frame.
From this very period. This is roughly the period, you know, within a year or two, of when the My Lai massacre took. Actually, it's actually the period when the My Lai massacre took place, 1968, which is what we're talking about. The My Lai massacre, which was finally broke through, thanks to Cy Hirsch, an independent journalist working for Dispatch News Service, was a very smart guy. He picked the moment of a huge demonstration in Washington, you know, 1 million people, a lot of journalists around. So he picked that moment to release publicly the information on My Lai that had been around for a year and a half. Nobody had paid any attention to. So it became a big thing. And that's kind of the symbol of everything that went wrong. It's a wonderful symbol for liberal intellectuals because you can blame it on half-educated, half-crazed GIs in the field who didn't know who was going to shoot at them next. There was a couple of journalists, mainly Kevin Buckley, who was Saigon correspondent of Newsweek. He and an associate, Alan Shimkin, I think his name was, did a detailed analysis of what was of the context of My Lai. This was part of a series of what were called post-Tet pacification campaigns, huge mass murder operations, to which My Lai was a minuscule footnote, and was such a small footnote that there's a Quaker hospital, which is Quang Ngai, right near where it took place. I mean, they knew about it at once. They didn't even bother mentioning it because it was happening all over the place. Well, Buckley wrote this all up, and Newsweek wouldn't publish it. He gave it to me. Ed Herman and I wrote about it in Political Economy of Human Rights, South End book in '79. What we pointed out was that, yeah, it took place, and it's easy to focus on it because you can blame it on bad guys, not like us. But what was actually taking place in the air-conditioned rooms where people just like us were sitting was incomparably more horrendous. You think anybody ever mentioned that? Well, actually one person did 30 years later. So it's marginally noticed. But, you know, what Kevin Buckley did and his associate was really good journalism.